A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb.
It was Saturday, August 4th, 1945. A meeting was convened on Tinian Island, 2,500 kilometers away from Japan. Colonel Paul Tibbets ushered in Captain William Deke Parsons, who had just weeks ago witnessed the Trinity nuclear bomb test in New Mexico. He would tell a small audience of airmen, "The bomb you are going to drop is something new in the history of warfare. It is the most destructive weapon ever produced. We think it will knock out everything within a 3-mile area." 2 days later, on August 6th, a flight surgeon handed Colonel Tibbets 12 cyanide capsules to be distributed to his crew. In the case that they were shot down, there would be no prisoners. If any of them didn't poison themselves, Tibbets was authorized to shoot them. Then, at 2:45, they boarded the Enola Gay, named after Tibbets' mother, Enola Gay Haggard. Lieutenant Morris Dick Jepson and Captain Parsons completed the assembly of the bomb on board. I'll never forget that feeling. You could see a good-sized city. Then you didn't see it anymore. It was simply gone. At 8:15, Major Thomas Farabee released the more than 4,000-kilogram bomb nicknamed Little Boy. Bomb away. Dropping down 30,000 feet, it detonated 43 seconds later, while it was still about 2,000 feet above the ground. The flash from the explosion was so bright that crew members on board thought they had instantly gone blind. If Dante had been with us on the plane, he would have been terrified. The city had completely disappeared under this awful blanket of smoke and fire. There was nothing but death in that cloud, all those Japanese souls ascending to heaven. The radio operator, Richard Jr. Nelson, the youngest crew member at only 20 years old, would deliver the news back to headquarters. Results, excellent. There was a stunned silence among the crew, save for the 6-word remark uttered by the co-pilot, Captain Robert Alvin Lewis. "My God, what have we done?" "100,000 people were killed immediately by the blast of the first bomb. Just 3 days later, on August 9th, the plutonium Fat Man bomb was released over Nagasaki, hitting north of the industrial center, obliterating the city. The combined death toll has been estimated to be upwards of 300,000 people, virtually all of them civilians. This Holocaust would mark the advent of the nuclear age, and, so far, the only instance of nuclear weapons being used in wartime. Citizens the world over have anxiously anticipated whether each major conflict since will devolve into nuclear war. Many close calls have been recorded. Teaching children at a young age that the use of the bombs in Japan actually saved lives and was therefore a lesser of two evils naturally enshrines an outlook on the world which informs them that instantly obliterating hundreds of thousands of people is, at least sometimes, morally justified. In other words, this outlook assumes that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were justified. There were 8 5-star generals and admirals during World War II, comprising the highest-ranking officers of the U.S. military. Of these 8, 7 believed that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were ultimately unnecessary. The Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. The atomic bomb played no decisive part from a purely military point of view in the defeat of Japan. The use of atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. I didn't like the atom bomb or any part of it. An effective naval blockade would, in the course of time, have starved the Japanese into submission through lack of oil, rice, medicines, and other essential materials. The first atomic bomb was an unnecessary experiment. It was a mistake to ever drop it. They had this toy and they wanted to try it out, so they dropped it. It killed a lot of Japs, but the Japs had put out a lot of peace feelers through Russia long before. It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons. It always appeared to us that, atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were already on the verge of collapse. On May 30th, 1945, former President Herbert Hoover sent a memo to President Harry Truman, urging him to change the surrender terms to allow Japan to keep their emperor, the one condition keeping them from surrendering. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, having read the memo, called it a wise, statesmanlike document, and had it been put into effect, would have obviated the slaughter at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in addition to much of the destruction of the island of Honshu by our bomber attacks. That the Japanese would have accepted it, and gladly, I have no doubt. The president's highest-ranking and closest military advisors came to this conclusion from, among other things, the absolute devastation inflicted on Japan by early 1945. Tokyo, for example, had suffered the single deadliest bombing raid in all of human history, killing 100,000 people. Aside from Tokyo, cities across the country were being destroyed. Indeed, Hiroshima was chosen as a target because it was one of the few remaining cities that wasn't destroyed by bombing. In May of 1945, Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew became a strong advocate of relaying to the Japanese that they would be able to keep their emperor if they surrendered. Following the, as he called it, terrific devastation inflicted on Tokyo from yet another major firebombing campaign, Grew met with the president to convince him to change the surrender terms. Truman told him to convene a meeting with the chiefs of staff and the secretaries of the War and Navy. The meeting was held on May 29th. Afterward, Grew wrote in a memorandum of the meeting, "The meeting lasted for an hour, and in the course of the discussion, it became clear that Mr. Stimson, Mr. Forrestal, and General Marshall were all in accord with the principle, but for certain military reasons, not divulged, it was considered inadvisable for the president to make such a statement just now." In his memoir, Grew wrote that after the meeting, "I duly reported this to the president, and the proposal for action was, for the time being, dropped." Secretary of War Henry Stimson would write in his diary what was really going on. It was an awkward meeting because there were people present in the presence of whom I could not discuss the real feature which would govern the whole situation, namely S1. S1 being the code name for the atomic bomb. In his autobiography, co-authored with McGeorge Bundy, Stimson declared, "It is possible, in the light of the final surrender, that a clearer and earlier exposition of American willingness to retain the emperor would have produced an earlier ending to the war. This course was earnestly advocated by Grew and his immediate associates during May 1945. The United States, by its delay in stating its position, had prolonged the war." By July, the situation was so dire in Japan, Stimson wrote the president in a top-secret memo, "We have the following enormously favorable factors on our side, factors much weightier than those we had against Germany. Japan has no allies. Her navy is nearly destroyed. She is terribly vulnerable to our concentrated air attacks upon her crowded cities, industrial and food resources. She has against her not only the Anglo-American forces, but the rising forces of China and the ominous threat of Russia. I believe Japan is susceptible to reason in such a crisis to a much greater extent than is indicated by our current press and other current comment. Japan is not a nation composed wholly of mad fanatics of an entirely different mentality from ours. On the contrary, she has within the past century shown herself to possess extremely intelligent people. She has not only built up powerful armies and navies, she has maintained an honest and effective national finance and respected position in many of the sciences in which we pride ourselves. I think the Japanese nation has the mental intelligence to recognize the folly of a fight to the finish. Contrary to the expressed opinion of the Secretary of War in 1945, the view that still largely prevails is best summarized by Fred Olivi, who co-piloted the plane which dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. He insisted that the United States had no choice but to drop the bomb because of the fanatical defense capabilities of the Oriental. Later in July, the Potsdam Conference commenced, bringing Churchill, Stalin, and Truman together. On July 17th, after the first round of talks, Truman wrote in his diary, "Just spent a couple of hours with Stalin. He'll be in the Jap War on August 15th. Fini Japs when that comes about." Truman's opinion was informed in part by a June 30th War Department report, which stated, short of nuclear war, the entry of the Soviet Union into the war would finally convince the Japanese of the inevitability of complete defeat. And according to a report from the Joint Chiefs as early as April, once convinced of the inevitability of defeat, it is possible that a government could be formed that would sign and could enforce a surrender instrument. On July 18th, Truman again took to his diary, this time recounting his meeting with Winston Churchill. Stalin had told PM of telegram from Jap Emperor asking for peace. Stalin also read his answer to me. It was satisfactory. Believe Japs will fold up before Russia comes in. I am sure they will when Manhattan appears over their homeland. Indeed, Truman had been able to read encrypted Japanese telegrams as a result of the Magic Intercept program. The Emperor's desire for peace had been on display for the Americans since the diplomatic cables written and received by his foreign minister were decrypted. Japan sought the Soviet Union to negotiate peace, in vain as the Soviets chose to string them along. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo had relayed to his ambassador to Moscow, "The substance of the following should be borne in mind as appropriate in your direct explanation to Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. It is His Majesty's heart's desire to see the swift termination of the war." The Potsdam Conference culminated in the Potsdam Declaration, an ultimatum to the Japanese that if they did not proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, they would face prompt and utter destruction. Acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew again tried his hand at maneuvering the language to include retention of the Emperor, and even got a sentence included in a draft of the declaration, in Article 12, which said that surrender may include a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty. By the time the Japanese government received the declaration on July 27th, this sentence had been deleted. Pursuant to this language, or lack thereof, regarding the status of the emperor, the Japanese announced publicly that they would ignore the declaration. In July of 1944, General Bonner Fellers, who led psychological warfare operations against the Japanese Empire, wrote a report detailing the status of the emperor to the Japanese people. Hanging of the emperor to them would be comparable to the crucifixion of Christ to us. Unfortunately for the Japanese, it appears from the historical record that they were party to a war plan that was predetermined. Writing candidly in his 1952 memoir, Harry Truman divulged, "Anxious as we were to have Russia in the war against Japan, the experience at Potsdam now made me determined that I would not allow the Russians any part in the control of Japan. As I reflected on the situation during my trip home, I made up my mind that General MacArthur would be given complete command and control after victory in Japan. We were not going to be disturbed by Russian tactics in the Pacific. Force is the only thing the Russians understand, and while I was hopeful that Russia might someday be persuaded to work in cooperation for peace, I knew that the Russians should not be allowed to get into any control of Japan. At no time from 1941 to 1945 did I ever hear it suggested by the president or by any other responsible member of the government that atomic energy should not be used in the war. Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used. Indeed, Harry Truman was convinced that the bomb should be used even before the Potsdam Conference, as confirmed by his Secretary of State Joseph Burns, who stated in an interview, "Neither the president nor I were anxious to have them enter the war after we had learned of this successful test." I and a good many others will always feel that had the president issued as far back as May 1945 the recommended categorical statement that the Japanese dynasty would be retained if the Japanese people freely desired its retention, the atom bomb might never have had to be used at all. That the Japanese were on the verge of surrender was supported by a survey conducted by the War Department, embarked on by over 1,000 staff members who interviewed hundreds of Japanese military officers, officials, politicians, and the like. Published in 1946, it would be titled the Strategic Bombing Survey. In their conclusion read the following: based on a detailed investigation of all of the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved, it is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to December 31st, 1945, and in all probability prior to November 1st, 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. I need your help. This channel relies on donations and patrons. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to support me and what I do, please consider becoming a patron. There are exclusive videos there. I accept donations through PayPal, Cash App. I also accept cryptocurrency. I accept Bitcoin and Ethereum donations. So please, if you want to support me, become a patron, give a donation. Those are ways that you can support me. And of course, most importantly of all, please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you so much. Take care. I love you so much.